be able to introduce our speaker who we have here today. And very pleased that you guys have signed up for this very important lecture. Dr. Robert Fritz is an assistant professor of Spanish and Portuguese in the Department of Global Languages and Theater Arts here at Murray State University. He earned his master's and doctoral degrees in Hispanic literature at Indiana University, Bloomington. I'm from Muncie, Indiana, so I'm a Hoosier. He also has a master's degree in European Studies from the Catholic University of Leuven in Leuven, Belgium. I don't know if I said that right, but hopefully I pronounced that right. Doc, you can correct me later. Dr. Fritz's primary area of expertise is medieval and Renaissance era Spanish literature, but he's also interested in Latino literature and has published an article in the 2007 novel, The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde by Junot Diaz, and leads service learning projects that enable Murray State University and students to engage in U.S. Latino culture and Spanish speakers who live in our community. So please, let's give him a great Murray State welcome, and let's give him some hand claps as we have him come and give his lecture. So without further ado, Dr. Fritz.
Love coming here and collaborating on these projects. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you so much. I also want to thank Deontay Turnley of the Office of Multicultural Initiatives for inviting me here to speak today in honor of Hispanic Heritage Month. I participated in last year's roundtable discussion of the term Latinx and enjoyed the opportunity to hear from a variety of voices about the use of gender-neutral language throughout the Hispanic world. It's an honor to be back again, and I appreciate the opportunity to once more engage in public discourse about language and identity in contemporary society. As someone who specializes in medieval and early modern Spanish literature, I more often find myself researching topics related to the political impact of 13th century Castile, of conflicts between the Holy Roman Empire and the papacy, or of early modern inquiries into the secrets of nature. It is rare that I get the chance to talk about other interests of mine as a scholar and educator who specializes in Hispanic literatures, and that's contemporary U.S. Latino literature. Even as I use the term Latino literature, I hear echoes of last year's discussion and readily welcome the use of Latinx instead. If last year's discussion taught us anything, it's that the nomenclature we use to refer to identities is a complex issue and one that is an ongoing process of negotiation in which communities that share identities strive for the language that will adequately express the complexity of their composition and reality, a language that always seems both just within reach and also just out of it. I use the term Latino not to exclude, but to recognize the standard grammar of Spanish, which, as we learned last year, forms an important part of the identity of millions of native speakers around the world. I refer then to Latino literature as a convention of grammar, whereby Spanish defaults to the O ending when we refer to a plurality of genders. It is perhaps a technicality, but one that I observe in my capacity as a professor of basic Spanish language, fully recognizing that it cannot capture the lived reality of an identity that many prefer to call Latinx. Another point of identity that I would like to address before proceeding to the subject of my talk, generously called the lecture by my host tonight, is my own identity. Full disclosure, I am not Hispanic. I speak Spanish as a second language, one that I learned growing up as a white kid in a small town in Kentucky. I'm not here today because I have some claim to a Hispanic identity. Rather, I am here by invitation as a professor of Spanish. Granted, I am obviously honored to be here because I appreciate the opportunity to collaborate with the Office of Multicultural Initiatives. I am also a professor, and my job is to profess. When people invite me to speak, I feel it is my professional obligation to speak. Nevertheless, it is a serious responsibility, indeed a challenge, to be tasked with speaking about the heritage of a people with whom I do not share common cultural or ethnic roots. Please know that I do so with great respect. I am not Hispanic, nor am I a person of color. I am white and grew up in a world with all the privilege that statement implies. Know then that I approach this task humbly and with trepidation, lest I be perceived to appropriate a heritage that is not mine. That is not my intention. Despite the implicit challenges, I accepted Mr. Turnley's invitation for two reasons. The first being the aforementioned fact that I am a professor of Spanish, and as such, my academic training may afford some insights into the nature of Hispanic identity for those who might like to know more about it. By no means do I want my word to be taken, however, as the last one. There is no one Hispanic heritage. It is improper to talk about a single Hispanic identity or experience. Instead, it is important to recognize, again, that language is not up to the tasks which we set to it. Hispanic is simply a term that may refer to Spanish speakers or those of Spanish-speaking descent. This term must accommodate a gamut of cultural diversity that stretches from the tip of South America all the way to Spanish-speaking communities in Canada. As a term for designating a cultural identity, it is so broad as to nearly be meaningless. Nevertheless, peoples of Hispanic origin do have a shared heritage by virtue of their language and shared historical origin in the colonization of the Americas by the Spanish Empire, beginning in the last part of the 15th century, when Columbus, a Genoese captain, by the way, and his ships set sail from Europe. Expecting to land in Asia, Columbus instead arrived in a land unknown to Europeans, a land already inhabited by millions of people who had resided here for thousands of years and had long histories of their own. It would take Columbus some time before he realized his mistake. In the meantime, it must be said, he and his contemporaries undertook a colonial project that wrought untold suffering and genocide upon the peoples of what would eventually come to be called the Americas. This initial trauma, however, gave rise to the peoples of, as we know it today, Latin America, in all of their diversity, history, and immense cultural diversity and beauty. They're linked in that diversity by the shared heritage of the Spanish language. It has since become a language of the Americas, one that is used as a mother tongue in families, in trade, in religion, and in Nobel Prize winning literary works. It is that heritage in particular about which I intend to speak today in my capacity as a professor of Hispanic literatures. Though we won't necessarily talk about literature written entirely in Spanish. Specifically, I intend to talk to you today about US Latino literature, that is, literature written by US authors of Hispanic descent. Although they write primarily in English, their work is nevertheless shaped profoundly by their cultural and linguistic roots in the Hispanic world. Although I do not share those roots and can only ever be a respectful interloper, there is at least one way in which my own heritage and identity coincide with those of the authors whose works I would like to share with you today. Namely, both myself and these authors share a common nationality. Each of us are Americans, and as such, we each have a stake in the common enterprise that is this country, the United States of America. Thus, I participate in this commemoration of Hispanic Heritage Month, not as an appropriator, but as a citizen of the United States who wants to share with those here today the literary accomplishments of fellow citizens. This beauty is more than a mere academic interest. I believe that through our shared appreciation of Latino literature, we can all of us share in a new kind of identity that unites us in a very meaningful and deeply human way. And you don't have to be a US citizen to partake in this identity. This República de Letras Latinas, so to speak. This identity is one that enables those who share it to better appreciate the beauty of the diversity of the United States of America, as well as the Americas in general. The appreciation of this beauty, as I hope to convince you tonight, is also a source of justice. For through the appreciation of Latino literature, we may also confront the ugliness of racism, injustice, and inequality, which denies those who inhabit this country from enjoying the full potential of what they aspire to be and what we as Americans have come to call our dream. For Latino authors often confront racism and injustice with the weapons they know best, their words. I admire those brave souls among us who use their freedom of speech to speak out against injustice and hate in the form of high art. To point out a shared problem is far from saying that you hate a place or a people, especially if a common solution could make life more just and prosperous for everyone. Yet, sadly, there are those among us who wish to silence those voices, the voices of fellow Americans, because they do not want to hear what they have to say. Thus, in addition to sharing a common Hispanic heritage, the authors whose works I will share with you tonight also have the dubious distinction of having had their works targeted for censorship at one point or another, in one form or another. So I take this occasion to speak about Latino literature as a moment to reaffirm truths that, for many of us, have long been self-evident, though it would seem they're truths that bear repeating. We need the freedom of speech because it enables us to point out injustice and to redress it. We should embrace this work and carry it forward, protecting the rights of our authors to write and the rights of readers to read. Let us turn now to the literature itself. I propose to read excerpts from 3 works of Latino literature that I found particularly meaningful. I did not use a scientific or even critical process to select these works. They're simply the ones that came to mind when I thought about works that I had personally read and enjoyed by Latino authors. They're also works that I feel showcase how Hispanic authors enrich our nation's literary heritage through the aesthetic beauty and moral courage of their work. Although it is just as difficult to reduce Latino literature to a single common denominator as it is Hispanic heritage itself, the works I share with you tonight highlight some of the intersectional dynamics of Hispanic identities, for ethnicity and language are but points in a constellation that also includes socioeconomic status, gender, and religion. In one way or another, then, the literature we will share tonight is literature precisely because it does all of those things artfully and in ways that move us emotionally, intellectually, and sometimes civically. By reading these works, I hope to let Hispanic voices speak for themselves so that we can appreciate them together in observance of the occasion. I would like to begin with the work of Rudolfo Anaya, an author from the Southwestern United States of Mexican-American heritage, often referred to as a Chicano author, which is a term often used to identify Latino authors specifically descended from Mexican heritage. He was born in 1937 and passed away, sadly, recently in 2020. He was the winner of the National Humanities Medal in 2015. Among his works are Bless Me, Ultima, which was really one of his breakthrough works and probably the one that is most cited as being his work. It is one of his most cited works. Bless Me, Ultima is a coming-of-age story about Antonio, or Tony, Mares y Luna. And even in the slight shift between his Spanish name and his English language moniker, Antonio and Tony, we see that the identity of the people in this novel straddles Hispanic heritage as well as their heritage as citizens of these United States. I would like to begin with the first chapter. The opening chapter of Bless Me, Ultima is really a beautiful way, I think, to show the diversity within Hispanic heritage, because we meet Antonio and his family in their home just as they're about to welcome Ultima, the name of a curandera, or a medicine woman who practices a type of folkloric tradition associated with medicine, but also magic in the novel. So let's begin from the beginning with the first chapter of Bless Me, Ultima. Ultima came to stay with us the summer I was almost 7. When she came, the beauty of the llano unfolded before my eyes, and the gurgling waters of the river sang to the hum of turning earth. The magical time of childhood stood still, and the pulse of the living earth pressed its mystery into my living blood. She took my hand, and the silent magic powers she possessed made beauty from the raw, sun-baked llano, the green river valley, and the blue bowl which was the white sun's home. My bare feet felt the throbbing earth and my body trembled with excitement. Time stood still, and it shared with me all that had been and all that was to come. Let me begin at the beginning. I do not mean the beginning that was in my dreams and the stories they whispered to me about my birth and the people of my father and mother and my 3 brothers, but the beginning that came with Ultima. The attic of our home was partitioned into 2 small rooms. My sisters, Deborah and Teresa, slept in one, and I slept in the small cubicle by the door. The wooden steps creaked down into a small hallway that led into the kitchen. From the top of the stairs, I had a vantage point into the heart of our home, my mother's kitchen. From there, I was to see the terrified face of Chavez when he brought the terrible news of the murder of the sheriff. I was to see the rebellion of my brothers against my father. And many times late at night, I was to see Ultima returning from the llano, where she gathered the herbs that be harvested only in the light of the full moon by the careful hands of a curandera. That night, I lay very quietly in my bed, and I heard my father and mother speak of Ultima. Está sola, my father said. Ya no queda gente en el pueblito de las pasturas. He spoke in Spanish, and the village he mentioned was his home. My father had been a vaquero all his life, a calling as ancient as the coming of the Spaniard to Nuevo Mexico. Even after the big rancheros and tejanos came and fenced the beautiful llano, he and those like him continued to work there, I guess because only that wide expanse of land and sky could they feel the freedom their spirits needed. Que lástima, my mother answered, and I knew her nimble fingers worked a pattern on the doily she crocheted for the big chair in the sala. I heard her sigh, and she must have shuddered too when she thought of Ultima living alone in the loneliness of the wide llano. My mother was not a woman of the llano. She was the daughter of a farmer. She could not see beauty in the llano, and she could not understand the coarse men who lived half their lives on horseback. And in this opening chapter, we see a number of themes that we'll revisit tonight. First of all, the use of Spanish and English to tell a single story. Many times Latino authors don't give us translations in the footnotes. And that is, I believe, better to reflect the lived experience of an identity that is as much linguistic as it is cultural and ethnic. And we see that throughout this novel as well, often portrayed with great beauty. We also see a diversity within the people of New Mexico or Nuevo Mexico. These people are descended from original settlers in this land who were commissioned by the Mexican government to settle a desert region before it was the United States. So these people that we're reading about are truly inhabitants of the era who established themselves before the United States existed. And in that way represent a very old culture as well. Furthermore, it is a culture with a diversity all its own. We see that Antonio Mares y Luna, his 2 last names, the Mares being the family of his father, ranchers, and the Lunas being the family of his mother, who are farmers who cultivate the land, sort of put them in a long-held traditional conflict with one another that unfolds throughout the novel in a series of tensions. One of the reasons, however, that this book has made the American Library Association's list of frequently challenged books is its religious content. The book recounts not only the life in the small town in New Mexico, but also the coming of age and religious experience of Antonio as he comes to grips with the religious traditions that surround him in his cultural environment. Of course, the Spanish Empire brought with it Catholicism and spread Catholicism throughout the Americas, and it remains today a powerful traditional religious belief within Latin America and within Hispanic culture. But in Bless Me Ultima, we get insight into another religious tradition associated with a more with non-Christian religious traditions of the peoples who predated the arrival of Columbus in 1492. So I'd like to read to you now from some passages related to religious issues that come to the fore in this novel. Again, Antonio speaking to us in first-person narrative voice. Then there was the thing about religion. My father was not a strong believer in religion. When he was drunk, he called priests women and made fun of the long skirts they wore. I had heard a story told in whispers, not meant for my ears, that once, long ago, my father's father had taken a priest from the church and beaten him on the street for preaching against something my grandfather Mares had done. So it was not a good feeling my father had for priests. My mother said the Mares clan was full of free thinkers, which was a blasphemy to her, but my father only laughed. My mother was a devout Catholic, and so she saw the salvation of the soul rooted in the Holy Mother Church. And she said the world would be saved if the people turned to the earth. A community of farmers ruled over by a priest, she firmly believed, was the true way of life. Why two people as opposite as my father and my mother had married, I do not know. Their blood and their ways had kept them at odds, and yet for all this, we were happy. Gathering herbs with Ultima, Antonio asks the curandera about the conflicts and tensions in his family and begins to learn more about the other religious traditions of which he also plays a role. Ultima, I asked, why are they so strange and quiet? And why are my father's people so loud and wild? She answered, it is the blood of the lunas to be quiet, for only a quiet man can learn the secrets of the earth that are necessary for planting. They're like the moon. And it is the blood of the mares to be wild like the ocean from which they take their name and the spaces of the llano that have become their home. And as we continue, we find that Ultima is more than a medicine woman, but also a practitioner of what we would regard as magic. And although many have noted elements of so-called magical realism in the work of Rudolfo Anaya, and it's undeniable that it does reflect certain elements of that, I would draw a finer distinction in that a true example of magical realism would be creation of a narrative world in which magic forms a regular part of everyday experience, and in which the characters understand it to form that part of their experience and don't necessarily regard it as strange. However, throughout Bless Me Ultima, we see Antonio struggle with the tensions of his mother's deep Catholicism and his own desire to become a Catholic priest, and contrasted with the religious traditions practiced by Ultima. We see this come to the fore in a conflict between Ultima, who in the narrative is considered to be a force of good, and the three Trementina sisters, who characters in the novel refer to as witches who practice a dark magic. They curse Tony's uncle, Lucas, and Ultima is called to take care of him and heal him. Again, Antonio. Will he live? I asked her while she covered him with fresh sheets. They let him go too long, she said. It will be a difficult battle. But why didn't they call you sooner? I asked. The church would not allow your grandfather to let me use my powers. The church was afraid that... She did not finish, but I know what she would have said. The priest at El Puerto did not want the people to place much faith in the powers of La Curandera. He wanted the mercy and faith of the church to be the villagers' only guiding light. Would the magic of Ultima be stronger than all the powers of the saints in the Holy Mother Church? I wondered. Ultima later explains the mechanism of the magic she practices to Antonio, saying, it is because good is always stronger than evil. Always remember that, Antonio. The smallest bit of good can stand against all the powers of evil in the world, and it will emerge triumphant. There's no need to fear men like Tenorio and his daughters. They're women who long ago turned from God, but they are amateurs. They have no power like the power of a good curandera. In a few days, they will be wishing they had never sold their souls to the devil. And then the process begins of removing the curse put upon Antonio's uncle. It's passages like these that have led some to try to ban Rudolfo Anaya's work, Bless Me Ultima, from public school curricula, because it does engage with religious issues. But again, I see it more as an exploration of a young person's struggle to find a religious identity that is based upon his own personal history and the history of his community. And I think it's an honest, earnest depiction of that struggle. And I think it's one that is also beautifully portrayed. And I encourage everyone to read Bless Me Ultima for those reasons alone. but there are other reasons as well. Bless Me Ultima also delves deeply into what it means to be a citizen of the United States, because it takes place at the beginning of the beginning of the novel takes place during the Second World War, because Antonio's three brothers are drafted and sent to fight in the war. And often the topic of the war comes up as conversation among the characters, as in this example. When Antonio's mother's family asks about her sons who are deployed in the war. They ask, and your sons, Leon, Andres, Eugenio? The letters say they are fine, my mother says, and her eyes were full of tears. But almost every day, there is a tolling of the bells for a son that is lost to the war. Take faith in God, my child, my grandfather said, and he held her close. He will return them safely. The war is terrible. The wars have always been terrible. They take the boys away from the fields and orchards where they should be. They give them guns and tell them to kill each other. It is against the will of God. He shook his head and knitted his eyebrows. I thought God must look that way when he's angry. This war of the Germans and the Japanese is reaching into all of us. Even in the refuge of the Valle de los Lunas, it reaches. We've just finished burying one of the boys of the Santos Esteban. There's much evil running loose in the world. The novel also features depictions of what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder suffered by veterans of the Second World War. In the novel, it's often referred to as war sickness. But again, this is a way that Latino literature engages directly and earnestly with contemporary social issues. And that, I think, deserves our attention as readers. Moreover, the novel reflects on what it's like to be different within a community. As we find in a passage describing Antonio's first day of first grade, when he attends an English-speaking school, when he himself has been brought up in Spanish and speaks barely a word of English. Let's hear from Antonio now regarding his first day in first grade. Miss Maestas took me to the front of the room and spoke to the other boys and girls. She pointed at me, but I did not understand her. Then the other boys and girls laughed and pointed at me. I did not feel so good. Thereafter, I kept away from the groups as much as I could and worked alone. I worked hard. I listened to strange sounds. I learned new names, new words. At noon, we opened our lunches to eat. Miss Maestas left the room and a high school girl came and sat at the desk while we ate. My mother had packed a small jar of hot beans and some good green chile wrapped in tortillas. When the other children saw my lunch, they laughed and pointed again. Even the high school girl laughed. They showed me their sandwiches, which were made of bread. Again, I did not feel well. The scene in which you see this child's identity contrasted with those around him makes us return to the passages about his brothers fighting in the Second World War for the idea of a country that didn't necessarily have space for otherness. Of course, throughout the novel, Antonio finds his space, and it is a space that does include his identities. And we do see the love and the depth of community in the town depicted in Bless Me Ultima. If Rudolfo Anaya is a grandfather of sorts of Latino literature, another great star in the universe of Latino authors is, of course, Sandra Cisneros, who was born in 1954 and happily is still with us today. Her most famous work is The House on Mango Street, which she published in 1984. And like Rudolfo Anaya, she also comes from Mexican-American heritage and is considered to be often a Chicana author. The House on Mango Street is also a coming-of-age novel, which tells the story of Esperanza. I apologize, I learned Spanish in Spain, so inevitably I sometimes accidentally slip into a teteo, as they call it. But of course, as my Mexican-American viewers would tell me, it is Esperanza Cordero. Esperanza Cordero lives with her family in urban Chicago, a far cry from the rural communities of New Mexico that we saw portrayed in Bless Me Ultima. Esperanza tells us the stories of everyday life in her neighborhood, where she too struggles with issues of identity that straddles both the English-speaking public identity of her school and her community, and also her Hispanic heritage as the daughter of immigrants from Mexico. It is also a book that shows us the intersectionality of Hispanic identities, because it is told from the perspective of an adolescent Mexican-American girl, also one who is economically disadvantaged. And as the novel shows us, is also a survivor of sexual violence. And in this regard, the novel does an amazing job of artfully addressing issues that are profoundly painful and otherwise ugly. And in that regard, it is truly a great work of literature. But it is also on the American Library Association's list of frequently challenged books. And in multiple school districts across the United States, communities have tried to get the book removed from school curricula, citing some of the adult themes in the novel that do try to address injustice in a very frank, open, and again, artful way. And I think that it does present us with conversations, the starting point for conversations that we should be having. And it would be a shame if our communities were to lose this important literary resource. Let's delve into the novel and see what the novel itself has to tell us about these issues. I want to begin by quoting to you a chapter. They are very short chapters. It's an easy novel to read in tidbits, and I encourage everyone to pick it up because it really is a wonderful book. This is a chapter called My Name, and Esperanza tells us about her name. In English, my name means hope. In Spanish, it means too many letters. It means sadness. It means waiting. It is like the number 9, a muddy color. It is the Mexican records my father plays on Sunday mornings when he's shaving, songs like Sobbing. It was my great-grandmother's name, and now it is mine. She was a horsewoman too, born like me in the Chinese year of the horse, which is supposed to be bad luck if you're born female. But I think this is a Chinese lie because the Chinese, like the Mexicans, don't like their women strong. My great-grandmother, I would have liked to have known her, a wild horse of a woman, so wild she wouldn't marry, until my great-grandfather threw a sack over her head and carried her off, just like that, as if she were a fancy chandelier. That's the way he did it. And the story goes, she never forgave him. She looked out the window her whole life, the way so many women sit their sadness on an elbow. I wonder if she made the best with what she got, or was she sorry because she couldn't be all the things she wanted to be? Esperanza. I have inherited her name, but I don't want to inherit her place by the window. At school, they say my name funny, as if the syllables were made out of tin and hurt the roof of your mouth. But in Spanish, my name is made out of something softer, like silver, not quite as thick as sister's name, Magdalena, which is uglier than mine. Magdalena, who at least can come home and become nene, but I am always Esperanza. I would like to baptize myself under a new name, a name more like the real me, the one nobody sees, Esperanza as Lisandra, or Maritza, or Zizi the X. Yes, something like Zizi the X will do. Again, remember that we are hearing the narration of an adolescent. She also addresses race in this novel, and we see racial dynamics in the communities of Chicago from the eyes of an adolescent in those communities. A chapter called Those Who Don't. In this chapter, Esperanza tells us, those who don't know any better come into our neighborhood scared. They think we're dangerous. They think we will attack them with shiny knives. They're stupid people who are lost and got here by mistake, but we aren't afraid. We know the guy with the crooked eye is Davy, the baby's brother. And the tall one next to him in the straw brim, that's Rosa's Eddie V. And the big one that looks like a dumb grown man, he's Fat Boy, though he's not fat anymore, nor a boy. All brown, all around. we're safe. But watch us drive into a neighborhood of another color, and our knees go shakety shake, and our car windows get rolled up tight, and our eyes look straight. Yeah, that's how it goes. More specifically, Esperanza also shares her impressions of what Hispanic heritage means, specifically Hispanic heritage related to being a Spanish speaker in the chapter called No Speak English. She tells us about the arrival of a woman who the children of the neighborhood only know as Mamacita. Mamacita is the big mama of the man across the street, third floor front. Rachel says her name ought to be Mama Sota, but I think that's mean. The man saved his money to bring her here. He saved and saved because she was alone with the baby boy in that country. He worked 2 jobs. He came home late and he left early every day. Then one day, Mamacita and the baby boy arrived in a yellow taxi. The taxi door opened like a waiter's arm. All at once, she bloomed, huge, enormous, beautiful to look at from the salmon pink feather on the tip of her hat down to the little rosebuds of her toes. I couldn't take my eyes off her tiny shoes. Then we didn't see her. I believe she doesn't come out because she is afraid to speak English. And maybe this is so, since she only knows 8 words. She knows how to say, "He not here," for when the landlord comes. No speak English if anybody else comes. And holy smokes. I don't know where she learned this, but I heard her say it one time and it surprised me. My father says when he came to this country, he ate ham and eggs for 3 months, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Ham and eggs. That was the only word he knew. He doesn't eat ham and eggs anymore. Whatever her reasons, she won't come down. She sits all day by the window and plays the Spanish radio show and sings all the homesick songs about her country in a voice that sounds like a seagull. Home, home, home. Home is a house in a photograph, a pink house. Pink as hollyhocks with lots of startled light. The man paints the walls of the apartment pink, but it's not the same. You know, she still sighs for her pink house, and then I think she cries. I would. Sometimes the man gets disgusted. He starts screaming, and you can hear it all the way down the street. Ay, she says. She's sad. Oh, he says, not again. Cuando? 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 She asks. Ay, caray, we are home. This is home. Here I am, and here I stay. Speak English. Speak English. Christ. Ay, Mamacita, who does not belong. Every once in a while lets out a cry, hysterical high, as if he had torn the only skinny thread that kept her alive, the only road out to that country. And then to break her heart forever, the baby boy who has begun to talk starts to sing the Pepsi commercial he heard on TV. No speak English, she says to the child who is singing in the language that sounds like tin. No speak English. No speak English, and bubbles into tears. No, 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 as if she can't believe her tears. And so the phrase she learned to tell people that she does not speak English, by the end of this ever so brief chapter, turns into a command to her baby son not to speak English, so that she can preserve that tie to the place she knows as home. In that sense, her Hispanic heritage is her language, it is her songs. And it's important to her that her son does not speak English so that she can preserve that heritage. In other chapters, Esperanza tells us more about the pattern of violence against women that she observes in her community, such as the chapter, Minerva Writes Poems. Esperanza says, Minerva is only a little bit older than me, but already she has 2 kids and a husband who left. Her mother raised her kids alone, and it looks like her daughters will go that way too. Minerva cries because her luck is unlucky, every night and every day, and prays, But when the kids are asleep after she's fed them their pancake dinner, she writes poems on little pieces of paper that she folds over and over and holds in her hands a long time. Little pieces of paper that smell like a dime. She lets me read her poems. I let her read mine. She's always sad like a house on fire, always something wrong. She has many troubles, but the big one is her husband who left and keeps leaving. One day she's through and lets him know enough is enough. Out the door he goes, clothes, records, shoes, out the window and the door locked. But that night he comes back and sends a big rock through the window. Then he is sorry and she opens the door again. Same story. Next week, she comes over black and blue and asks, what can she do? Minerva, I don't know which way she'll go. There's nothing I can do. It's a particularly moving portrait of these two women's lives, Esperanza and Minerva, and how they both find some agency and the ability to write poetry. And in that sense, again, I think it shows us the power of literature to become its own kind of identity for those who read it and write it, in a way of addressing a lack of agency that we might have in our lives. And near the end of the book, The House on Mango Street, Esperanza tells us about a house of her own. She describes this house in these terms: not a flat, not an apartment in back, not a man's house, not a daddy's. A house all my own, with my porch and my pillow, my pretty purple petunias, my books and my stories, my two shoes waiting beside the bed, nobody to shake a stick at, nobody's garbage to pick up after, only a house quiet as now, a space for myself to go, clean as paper before the poem. And here, work of literature uses literature itself as a metaphor for the life that this girl wants for herself and her future. Finally, in the last work of literature that we'll read from tonight in observance of Hispanic Heritage Month, I'd like to turn to a recent novel written by Jennine Capo Crucet, who was born in 1981 and is currently an associate professor at University of Nebraska-Lincoln. The name of the novel is Make Your Home Among Strangers, and it's from 2015. And I chose this novel to share it with you tonight because in this novel, we have the coming of age story of a first generation college student who comes from a Cuban American family who lives in Southern Florida. And she applies to a school located very far away in another part of the country where she feels a bit out of place. And I think that in addition to exploring the dynamics of the Cuban American identity, the novel also does a great job of portraying the challenges of being a first generation college student whose identity might not be a comfortable fit for the environment where they find themselves. In order to understand this passage in which the narrator and protagonist of the novel, Lisette, returns to her family's home in Florida for the first time during her first semester, during the first Thanksgiving break of her college career. Her visit coincides with an international controversy related to a little boy who has been found adrift off the coast of Florida. He is the lone survivor of a group of Cuban refugees who left Cuba in order to come to the United States. The novel takes place at a time when the wet foot, dry foot policy was still in place, whereby Cuban refugees automatically acquired refugee status by setting foot on US soil. Of course, many of you will remember the incident of Elian Gonzalez, who in 1999 was the lone survivor of a group of Cubans who fled Cuba and perished off the coast of Florida, including his mother. He was brought to the United States and allowed to live with family here until eventually being repatriated to Cuba. It was a very controversial moment for the Cuban American community and divided the community between those who believed that Elian should be allowed to stay in the United States and those who felt that he should be returned to his family in Cuba. This is a fictionalized account in which Capo Crucet renames the refugee child Ariel Hernandez, but his story retains many of the contours of Elian's story. And so this Lizette's first visit to her home overlaps with the breaking news of Ariel Hernandez's reception in Southern Florida. Lisette tells us, that night, as we sat to eat dinner in the area we called the dining room, but which was really just a table and 3 chairs set off by a square of linoleum a few feet from the couch, my mom was too frantic, too happy, talking about being interviewed, about the people she'd met at the protests. And I didn't want to spoil that for her with news of my Rawlings University hearing, not after what Lydie, my sister, had told me that morning. Mommy was in such good spirits that she cooked bistec palomilla, my favorite, with tons of extra onions, the meat pounded so thin that before she fried it, you could see light through the sinewy slab. And I knew from the meal that she'd forgiven me for my stupid plan to come home without telling her. I lowered my face over my plate and let the steam and the smell of almost burnt onions fill my whole head and displace the foreign college world terms: plagiarism, academic integrity, student code of conduct, as well as the words those would boil down to were I to try and explain things to them. Cheating. A brief aside here. During her first semester at university, Lisette is accused of plagiarism in one of her papers. Through the course of the novel, we learned that there was no bad intent on her part, but rather she simply wasn't familiar with the norms of academic honesty, earning her a narrow escape and a reprieve, enabling her to stay at Rawlings University under academic probation. But at this moment, her family still doesn't know that any of this is happening. For most of dinner, I was grateful for the distraction of the Ariel conversation. My mom smiled at how slowly I chewed, not knowing that I was just trying to keep my mouth busy. What everybody's saying is that he made it here, right? Mommy said. So that's it, he could stay, that's the law. If you're Cuban and you make it to dry land, when you ask for asylum, you get it, done. Everybody knows that. She worked a chunk of the thin steak between her molars. I didn't want to say what she thought of, as the law was probably very much open for debate. He hadn't made it to the US unassisted. He'd been picked up at sea and brought in, so the wet foot, dry foot element, which already seemed like a tricky way to distinguish which Cubans got sent back and which got to stay and eventually apply for political asylum, was more complicated than my mom wanted to admit. Plus, Ariel Hernandez wasn't just a minor, he was a little kid. How could my mom, who is friends with so many people who've been brought by their parents from Cuba, think that someone so young would get to decide in which country he'd grow up? I cut another sliver of meat, speared a perfect loop of onion for the same bite, chewed and chewed. And so over the course of this dinner, we're contemplating the nature of the Cuban American identity through food, through language, through current events, as well as the own personal crisis that Lisette faces, being under suspicion of academic dishonesty and plagiarism. I'd now like to turn to Lisette's experience at Rawlings, the university she attends, where she finds her own identity likewise difficult to parse with many of her dorm mates and classmates. The story begins with her, this chapter begins with her talking about her boyfriend back home in Florida, Omar, and how she talks about Omar to her dorm mates. That first semester of college, as I grew more and more impatient during phone conversations with Omar, I started to tell anyone who asked that Omar was a monster. He was an animal, more like an animal than a human. It seemed like what other people wanted to hear. To them, Omar looked the part, with his earring and the close-cut hair and goatee, the wide shoulders, the dark brows, him leaning on his Integra and throwing a sideways peace sign to almost every photo of him I owned. The girls on my floor would ask, "Is that a gang sign?" And instead of saying, "No, you're an idiot," I said, "Maybe. Who knows with Omar?" Other girls would feel bad for me and claim they understood. The girl who'd made everyone hot chocolate, Caroline, even went so far as to mention that she read The House on Mango Street in AP English. She said that she knew about the kinds of relationships that plagued my community, had nodded in a solemn way when I told her, yes, Omar could be rough. Part of me was angry that they were half right. My parents did have a version of that relationship, but it wasn't as all accurate for me and Omar. Still, I was happy to have something to add to those late nights in the dorm's common room when I was otherwise quiet, to be included in conversations, even if I didn't totally understand the part I was playing. When everyone around you thinks they already know what your life is like, it's easier to play into that idea. It was easier for me to make Omar sound like a psycho papi chulo who wanted to control me. At the very least, it made trying to make friends simpler than it would have been had I tried to be a more accurate version of myself. The truth is, I had to abandon some part of myself to leave Omar in Miami. I had to adopt some twisted interpretation of everything that came before college to make my leaving him the right thing. I had to believe the story I made up for other people. I chose that passage because I think it shows how the effort to find a place in your first year of college can be complicated by people who don't understand you, but think they do. And in a way, sort of pressures people in that situation to conform to something that they're actually not, because the loneliness of existing outside of that sphere of friends and social belonging is a difficult position to be in. And we see Lisette struggle with this issue of identity among her classmates and dorm mates at Rawlings. Finally, I've chosen another passage that shows how this can actually work the other way by quoting a passage in which she talks about how a TA in one of her classes expects her to exhibit the hallmarks of magical realism, which we addressed earlier in the context of Rudolfo Anaya's Bless Me, Ultima. So she's leaving the house of her father. Her parents divorced the week that she left for college, and she hasn't seen her father since, but she just met him the week of Christmas, and he gave her envelopes of money to share with the family. The problem is Lisette told her family that she was going to see her boyfriend, Omar, and now she has to figure out how to explain how she got these envelopes of money from her father. And so she's thinking about what to do during the drive back to her mother's place. Maybe seeing the old house would give me the answer. The house will tell me what to do, I thought. I'd learned about magical realism in my writing seminar when the TA had made weirdly consistent eye contact with me during the 2 class meetings where he was in charge and where we discussed it. He held his palm out to me at the end of every point he made and kept saying, right? His assumption being, I guess, that I knew what he was talking about because pronouncing my last name required the rolling of an R. At one point, he referred to magical realism as my literary tradition and asked me to explain that concept to my classmates. He held both his hands out to me then, like I was supposed to drop my genetically allotted portion of magical realism into them, pass it between us like an imaginary ball at a rave. I tried my best. I said, I don't know if we have any traditions like that, sir. My parents don't really read. He gave a short laugh like I just offended him, and after blinking hard, grinned through closed lips. And I knew from that tightrope smile, from the slow way he talked me through what he presumed I meant to say, that he thought I was an idiot. And so now, as I navigated the city's asphalt grid toward my old house, I fantasized that it would happen, that a parrot or an iguana would drop out of a tree and trudge over to me, talk in Spanish about my destiny and tell me what to do. Or maybe some palm fronds from the trees lining the street would reach down and cradle me, then ferry me to an old spirit woman who'd call me by some ancient name and inscribe the answers to my problems on the back of a tiger/dragon/shark. Better yet, maybe she would become my temporary mom, since Ariel was borrowing mine. I had high hopes for my old house as metaphor. My old house as fantastical plot element to be taken literally. My old house as lens via which I could examine the narrative of our familial strife. I was ready for what I'd been taught about myself, about what it meant to be like me, to kick in. She arrives home and observes. The yard stood solid and still. no part of that concrete was going to speak to me. If I indulged the sorry excuse for magic and kept talking to imaginary people about imaginary choices, I worried I'd never go back to my mom's apartment or to the freezing dorm room 1,000 miles away or to anywhere I didn't belong. I couldn't let my imagination give me other options. It was too painful to admit they weren't real. I shifted my eyes to the dashboard, refusing to look into the house's windows or at the front door, and watched my hand as it forced the car into reverse. I wanted to finish with this reflection of Lisette tonight, because I think it tells us a lot about what we have to learn and certain risks to avoid when we engage with Latino literature. On the one hand, it's a beautiful way to try to understand Hispanic heritage because it at once familiarizes us with language, culture, and traditions in a very profound and beautiful way. But on the other hand, we don't want those literary representations, which are fundamentally fiction, to become romanticized images of the historic reality of people who actually exist and have complex lives and are not simply characters in a novel that we can understand by reading the novel, or who we can assume know what magical realism is or expect to live in a world of magical realism. We want to avoid those pitfalls and instead let Latino literature help us to contemplate what it means to be Hispanic, but also an American, both in terms of being someone who resides within the United States and part of the Americas. And finally, I would like to address a way in which the voice of Jennine Capo Crucet has also suffered a form of very ugly censorship. In 2019, she made a campus visit to Georgia Southern University, where a contentious talk ensued at the assembly where she was speaking. Some students accused her of racism towards whites when she was engaged in a conversation about race in general and brought up white privilege. Following the event, an angry group of students found copies of her book, tore them up, and burned them on a grill. So I think the incident shows us that we still have a lot of work to do as Americans to stand up for our freedoms and to defend literature against those who would seek to censor it. So I leave you tonight with these thoughts about Hispanic heritage, about the wonderful works of literature that our fellow Americans have gifted to us, sharing with us their rich heritage, but also using artful voices to tell us what's happening in our own country and to take measures to redress it. So I leave you with that, and I want to thank again the Office of Multicultural Initiatives for inviting me to speak tonight. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I do apologize for taking so long. Thank you. Good night.